Thank you for inviting me to address you at this year's Martin Luther King Jr. Symposium. I'm sorry that we can't be together in person given the circumstances, but I am glad that technology still allows us to connect in this way. I truly do consider it an honor. And I also, of course, want to acknowledge the powerful legacy of Dr. Joseph L. White as the godfather of Black psychology and his tremendous contributions to the field, as well as his mentorship of students and professionals of color. Since my act of protest in 2015, when I lowered the Confederate flag there at the South Carolina State Capitol, I've gotten invitations every year to speak at various community events marking the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday. But I don't think that any occasion has been as consequential as this one, coming just days after what is arguably one of the most significant events in US history since the start of the Civil War. So I've given a lot of thought to what I want to say to you today, even as I continue to process these events myself. You know, the sight of a Confederate flag being carried through the Capitol just hours after Georgia elected a Black man and a Jewish man to the US Senate captures a dichotomy in American politics that has existed since its founding. It also reflects a deep ongoing trauma that we experience time and again in this nation. We make a seeming stride toward equality and democracy, only to encounter another episode of violent racist backlash. I've witnessed this pattern firsthand in my own lifetime, while becoming more conscious of it as a defining element of American culture. Just 3 years ago, 2018, marked 50 years since the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., and the year was filled with a series of commemorative events acknowledging the occasion. I was present for a couple of these. One took place in Atlanta, Georgia at the King Center, where I was invited to address the annual MLK holiday gathering. The other took place in Memphis, Tennessee at the National Civil Rights Museum, located at the site of Dr. King's assassination. Both events were a deeply surreal experience for me for slightly different reasons. At that point, it had been just 5 years since the moment I made a conscious decision to become more involved in activism. It was the summer of 2013 that I had joined in the Moral Monday movement, which was organized and led by the North Carolina state chapter of the NAACP, and had volunteered to be arrested in a protest over voting rights, something that I would have never imagined doing at any time prior to that. You see, I grew up with my parents teaching me to have an awareness of Black history and of the struggles that were undertaken for me to enjoy the freedoms I have. I was told of my third great grandparents, Theodore and Minerva Diggs, who were enslaved on a plantation in Rembert, South Carolina. I was told of my fourth great grandfather, Stephen Jenkins, who was enslaved on a tobacco plantation in Hertford County, North Carolina. And I was imbued with a sense of duty and responsibility to be the best I could personally be, to honor the sacrifices of past generations who were denied such opportunity. Still, I would say that the overall message I received from the adults around me as I was growing up was that my ancestors had struggled so that I would not have to, that others had protested and had been arrested and beaten and risked their lives so that I would not have to. I belong to the post-civil rights generation, the ones who supposedly inherited the dream. We were the youth who volunteered for the Obama campaign, who celebrated in the streets that November evening in 2008 as the elders around us shed tears and said they never thought they would see the day. The papers were filled with headlines asking if we'd finally arrived in a post-racial America. But by 2013, our generation was clear that the answer to that question was no. And we began to fill the streets in protest at levels not seen since the civil rights movement of the 60s. By 2013, we had witnessed the racist backlash to the election of Barack Obama and to the demographic changes occurring in the United States. In my home state of North Carolina, that backlash included an explicit attack on voting rights and an effort by the state legislature to target and disenfranchise Black voters and student voters, two demographics that had been key in the state breaking for Obama. This renewed attack on voting rights was happening everywhere, and it coincided with the Trayvon Martin case, a modern day lynching that echoed the killing of Emmett Till. Overnight, it seemed there was a relentless effort to push the nation as far back to the pre-civil rights era as possible. And all of it was happening in the middle of the first Black presidential administration. People have frequently asked me, how does someone become an activist? And I don't think my story differs from most others. It wasn't that I said to myself, now in this moment, I will become an activist. I simply recognized a grave injustice was occurring and felt compelled to respond to it. So deeply compelled that I was willing to be arrested over it. At that time in 2013, I was hardly a nationally known figure. I was simply an artist and a recent college graduate, joining with several other young people who protested at the North Carolina General Assembly building that day. 5 years later, as I stepped to the podium for the MLK celebration in Atlanta, now as someone who was nationally recognized for my activism, I was in a markedly different place mentally and emotionally than I had been in 2013. There in Atlanta, I found myself looking out over an audience that included the late John Lewis, someone I had only known through history books, film, and television. My mind immediately flashed back to that first time I was arrested, when I was handcuffed and placed in the back of a police wagon along with 5 others. Riding to the jail in that wagon, I had thought of John Lewis and of the other freedom riders. Mainly, my thoughts at that time centered on the differences in our experience. Even though I had been arrested, I had no concerns that I might lose my life that day. The feeling of being in such a vulnerable position with my hands cuffed behind my back only gave me a deeper appreciation for the courage of people like John Lewis, who'd faced far more dangerous situations, thrown into jails in Mississippi and Alabama, where they never knew if they might make it out alive or not. But now that I stood there looking at John Lewis in the flesh, with 5 years between that first arrest and this moment in 2018, the realities of the history I had inherited never felt so recent or so close. I had seen and experienced so much more since that summer day in 2013. I had witnessed the events in 2014, when multiple Black people were murdered by police on camera without consequence, finally leading to an extended open rebellion in Ferguson, Missouri, in the aftermath of the killing of Mike Brown. I had witnessed police mobilize as a militarized force against the Black citizens there, unleashing everything from attack dogs to tanks and sniper rifles. I witnessed the same occur again the following year in Baltimore, Maryland, and then again the year after that in my own hometown of Charlotte, North Carolina. In 2015, I had witnessed the state of South Carolina show more concern and care for the display of its Confederate flag than for the lives that were lost when a white supremacist murdered 9 Black parishioners at a historically Black church in Charleston. By 2018, I no longer felt that my rights or my life or those of the young activists and organizers of this era were any more secure than those of John Lewis's day. My visit to Memphis brought things into even more stark relief. It was my first time visiting the site, and as I rounded the corner to approach the museum, I was awestruck to find myself standing in a place frozen in time. I was no longer in 2018, but had been transported to that fateful day in April 1968. There was the balcony, looking just as it did on the day Dr. King was assassinated. Cars from that era were parked just below. Later, as I sat in the audience and watched Reverend Jesse Jackson stand in the place where Dr. King had been killed and recount events from his own memory, I understood just how brief a period of time 50 years was. On one hand, a remarkable amount of things had changed since that time. But on the other, so much hadn't fundamentally changed. And really, how much had we expected to change in that amount of time? By this point, we were 2 years into the Trump administration, an era of intense racist backlash to the Obama years that had preceded it. As I became viscerally aware of how brief 50 years really was, my goodness, the 150 years since the Civil War really wasn't that long ago either, was it? What does it mean that I'm living in an era where monuments to the Confederacy are stationed in front of every courthouse in my state? When slavery is still a controversial topic in academic curricula? When the racist police brutality that people have protested for decades continues unabated, even as it's now regularly captured on video? When public schools have essentially resegregated across the country? When voting rights remain under attack? When the racial wealth gap and housing discrimination remain at the same levels they did at the time of King's assassination? I've come to believe that historical awareness is one of the most powerful things an individual can possess. It's key to self awareness and is what empowers us to be more than passive bystanders or observers to the events happening around us. We are all impacted by history, whether we are conscious of it or not. Everyone who witnessed the events of January 6th knows they witnessed a major historical event, but not everyone can immediately place those events into historical understanding. The days since have been filled with people asking questions like, how did this happen? How did we get here? Why were white supremacist groups allowed to storm the Capitol like that? Why were they treated differently than Black Lives Matter protesters? Is it possible that individuals from the police and military were involved? What does this say about the state of our democracy? But the historically conscious person is not confused by any of this. The historically conscious person watched the events unfold in real time and already had answers to each of those questions. In fact, those who are historically conscious saw this coming long before it happened. And it's why we've been so adamant in warning everyone about this for years now, even as we've been accused of being hyperbolic or alarmist. The most confused or surprised individuals in this moment are those who've bought into the mythos of American exceptionalism, while the individuals with the most clarity are those who have not, and who are instead operating with an accurate understanding of American history. What is the mythos of American exceptionalism? It's the idea that America is uniquely democratic and therefore uniquely impervious to the threats that other nations face. American exceptionalism is the myth that says America introduced the idea of democracy to the world, that America represents the furthest progress humanity has ever made toward democracy, and that despite our flaws, America has been on a steady, progressive tread toward democracy and equality since its inception. That can never happen here, or this is something that only happens in foreign countries, is a common refrain in American exceptionalist thinking. Many of us who warned about the dangers of Trumpism and the possibility of America becoming a dictatorship were frequently told, oh, that can never happen here. American exceptionalism is actually rooted in a basic ignorance of American history. It fails to understand that everything people say can never happen here has already happened here and can happen here again. For example, it's been very common for people to compare the threat of Trumpism to the rise of Mussolini and Hitler. And while that's important for everyone to understand what fascism is as a distinct phenomenon, it's also vital for everyone to know that the Nazis modeled their policies against Jewish citizens off of Jim Crow segregation practices in the American South. And January 6th, 2021 is not the first time an insurrectionist mob has attempted to overthrow a democratically elected government in America. In recent days, you may have seen commentators comparing it to events in other countries, but the nearest historical comparisons are events that occurred in this country, like what happened in 1898, when an armed white mob attacked the city of Wilmington, North Carolina, burning buildings and massacring people in order to oust Black representatives who'd just been elected to office. This points to another great danger of American exceptionalist thinking. It credits America for any social progress that's been made here, while failing to recognize how that progress has always been achieved by the struggles of the oppressed against the status quo majority, and how it's never been a straight line of uninterrupted progress. The brief era of Reconstruction following the Civil War is a perfect example. Black Americans actually had more freedoms and rights and political representation in Congress during that brief era between emancipation and the imposition of Jim Crow than we would have in the nearly 100 years that followed the violent overthrow of Reconstruction. By the time of Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement, people were fighting not for new rights, but for the recognition of rights that were supposed to have already been in existence under the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. What this tells us is that, contrary to the idea that progress just comes with time, progress is hard fought through struggle and easily lost without constant vigilance. Because of the actions of the US Supreme Court, which gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965, one of Dr. King's landmark civil rights achievements, we actually have fewer voting rights today than we had in 2008. And that's very important to understand. American democracy, something that has yet to be fully realized here, is currently on life support. Nothing guarantees that it survives. But one thing that guarantees it doesn't is if we take its existence for granted and fail to understand that freedom is won through struggle and resistance against oppression. One of the things I've become most acutely aware of since becoming involved in the modern movement and devoting myself to studying more history is that we actually don't do a great job of teaching movement history. For this reason, there's a lot of popular misunderstanding of how movements are built and sustained, or how crucial they've been and continue to be in achieving the rights and freedoms we currently enjoy. People understand that change happens without understanding how it happens. Everything from the 40-hour work week to laws against child labor, voting rights for women, and civil liberties are the result of organized movements built and led by everyday people, the vast majority of whom aren't recorded by name in any history books. Popular understanding of the civil rights movement, for instance, is typically a highlight reel of events based on the most popular existing photos and film footage. Brown v. versus Board of Education ruling, the lynching of Emmett Till, Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott, the lunch counter sit-ins and freedom rides, the March on Washington, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, Bloody Sunday in Selma, Alabama, the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And then we just somehow magically achieved equality, right? That's kind of the common narrative. So it's not surprising that many people's perception of activism is that it only looks like newsworthy, dramatic, and history-making events led by famous figures and harrowing circumstances that somehow shifts the tide of public opinion overnight. But it's key to understand that a movement is actually many people doing many things in many places at once. And that's important because people often have a very narrow definition of what activism is and what it looks like. What I just recounted to you in that brief series of highlights spanned 11 years of time. Not only were there hundreds, if not thousands, of other events that are lesser known, but still crucial to the fight for racial equality in that period of time, each of those key events that I did highlight involved many people playing various different roles on various different fronts. Brown v. Board of Education involved civil rights attorneys using their legal training to fight in the courtrooms. Mamie Till, like the families of victims today, responded to a horrific situation that was forced upon her by forcing America to not look away from what had happened. Rosa Parks wasn't the first person to refuse to give up her seat. And she also wasn't simply a tired seamstress on the bus. She was an experienced organizer who was strategic in her actions. And the bus boycott was only possible because of massive, sustained organization by an entire community of people, organizing carpools, working as a collective. The lunch counter sit-ins and freedom rides were organized by students using direct action tactics that actually made a lot of the old guard civil rights leaders at the time uncomfortable because it was such a confrontational style, and so forth and so on. So my point is that there are multiple front lines in this fight. It's just as true today as it ever was. Every person, wherever they are, has a duty to examine what is at stake in these times and ask what they are able to do, where they are, with the skills they have. Dr. Joseph L. White is a perfect example of this. His groundbreaking work in the field of psychology is a form of activism. The healthcare workers who are fighting right now to address health disparities in our communities during the pandemic are engaging in a form of activism. Teachers who are advocating on behalf of Black and Brown children in the classrooms are engaging in a form of activism. And while it might not look exactly like the activism of those of us who protest in the streets, we are all relying on each other in order to advance the same cause. I strongly discourage this idea regarding activism as a standalone profession, actually. In recent years, this concept of so called celebrity activism or engaging in activism as a form of career advancement has really distorted understanding of what activism is, in my opinion. And it really inhibits our ability to build the kind of wide scale people's movement that's required to dismantle things like structural racism and economic injustice to achieve the kinds of deep systemic change that we need. I am an artist. I am a writer. I am a communicator. I say that to people all the time. Yes, I am known for my acts of, activism in this movement, but I show up in this movement alongside the millions of others who show up as I am to contribute what I have to contribute. Contrary to what many people assumed at the time, I did not simply hop up that Saturday morning in June 2015 and decide on my own to scale the flagpole in South Carolina. It was the result of multiple people working together. When the horrific events occurred in Charleston, I was by that time living in Charlotte, North Carolina, and organizing with a local grassroots collective there. Charlotte is just an hour north of Columbia, South Carolina, where the Confederate flag had been on display since the 60s as a statement of opposition to the civil rights movement and pressure to desegregate. And of course, we were all horrified, like everyone, at what we were witnessing. Not just the violent attack on a historically Black church by a white supremacist, but also how so much more concern was shown for the Confederate flag than for the implications of what had just happened. It was undeniable, the message that was being sent by South Carolina in refusing to lower its Confederate flag, even as it lowered the United States flag. So we came together, a group of us, and discussed taking action to remove the flag on our own. Um, the reason that someone had to scale the pole that day was simply because of how South Carolina had the flag attached to the pole. They had actually designed it with an internal pulley system so that someone couldn't simply walk up there and lower it, by hand or cut a rope and take it down. And so that's how it came to be that, the method was that somebody must scale the pole. And so we had to discuss very clearly, like, what are the roles that are involved in trying to do something like that. The first question that we had to ask ourselves was, who is physically capable of scaling the pole or learning how to scale the pole, who could also risk being arrested, because we knew that whoever did that was at high risk of being arrested, and everyone wasn't necessarily in the position to be arrested. I mentioned teachers earlier as being activists and a very important part of this movement. Some of the people who were present were teachers. Some of the people were employed in positions where they didn't necessarily feel like they could take that risk of being arrested. I happened to be working as an organizer at that time, and so I knew that I could take that risk of being arrested. Of course, we also recognized the powerful image that could be created in seeing a Black woman in that role. Not only am I a Black woman, but I am directly descended from people who were enslaved in South Carolina. This is also where my background as an artist, as a writer, as someone who is familiar with media and communications came into play, because I also felt comfortable kind of handling some of the media attention that we knew would come with this. To be willing to kind of step forward, kind of similar in a way to Rosa Parks, which this action has been compared to, being willing to kind of be a spokesperson in that moment and to really speak for the group and for why we had chosen the course of action that we did. But even once it was clear that I would be the person in that role, there were still many other roles for people to take on. We knew that somebody had to be in the role of helping me over the fence, because not only had South Carolina designed the pole with this internal pulley system, they had built this 4 foot tall spoked fence to further protect the flag. So somebody had to help me hop over. And that was when we talked it through a little bit more. We said, well, what do we want to communicate visually with this action? And we decided that it should be a white man, that it should be James Tyson, who would help me over the pole and help me over the fence and get arrested alongside me, so that we could really demonstrate racial solidarity and the fact that the work of dismantling racism cannot just be the labor of people who have been oppressed, right? But also people who have been beneficiaries of that oppression. It can't just be Black people fighting racism. White people have to take a stand in that as well. There were a whole lot of other rules. We knew that we were going to be arrested. Somebody had to be, at the phone and at the ready for when we needed bail. Somebody had to be ready to, deal with the first flood of media attention that might come in. Somebody was there to train me on how to scale the pole, because I didn't have any experience on doing something like that prior to that. It was actually a Greenpeace activist who had experience scaling trees who taught me on that method. So there were a lot of different roles for people to play. It's been over 5 years now since those events. And as people continue to ask me about the details of it, they often say, I'm sure you're tired of talking about it. But honestly, I'm not. I don't hesitate to recount the story, because I think it's important for people to understand that the success and impact of that action was the result of deliberate planning and the contributions of several people from different walks of life and professional backgrounds. So, how do you plan to show up in this moment? That's what you have to ask yourselves. Years and years from now, when people ask what you were doing during this time in history, what will you say to them? Resistance cannot just be a catchy slogan or even something that exists only in response to the Trump administration. The reality is that we still have a long fight ahead of us. While we fight for progress on reproductive justice, environmental justice, racial justice, disability justice, gender justice, economic justice, we face an opposition that is just as dedicated to setting our efforts back as far as possible. I spoke earlier of the myth of American exceptionalism, and we must be very careful that the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. is not folded into that dangerous mythos either. Here we are again, 50 years since his assassination, and we still have people claiming that Martin Luther King Jr. laid down his life for American democracy, right? Or that racism has ended because of his sacrifice. And that is dangerously ahistorical. For one, King did not view the civil rights movement as complete at the time of his death. His life was cut short just as he was embarking on what he considered to be the next necessary part of the movement, which would focus on issues of poverty and war. It's also dangerously ahistorical to claim that we've resolved all the issues of the civil rights movement, because we absolutely have not. In fact, the only issue in the civil rights movement that was ultimately resolved was the desegregated access to public facilities and businesses. Everything else, from voting rights to education to policing to poverty and structural racism itself, remains an ongoing struggle. That's the context we exist in today, over 50 years later, and it's important that we understand that. We have to understand the events we witnessed a couple weeks ago within the context of American multiracial democracy being an incomplete, unrealized idea. It's not that we're fighting to preserve democracy, but to achieve a democracy that has yet to be born here. When we understand it in that context, it calls on us to do more than passively valorize figures of the past, but to see in ourselves and in our present time a duty and obligation to be active architects in building the incomplete democratic project. That means we not only study and learn from the past, but we lend our own radical imaginations to envisioning the world that we want. We don't simply take down monuments and flags. We decolonize our very way of thinking. We transform institutions and forge new ways of being. I do think that one positive good to come out of this era is that it's taught many of us the danger of taking anything for granted. It's true that we are the beneficiaries of those who engaged in struggle before us. What we can see very clearly, however, is that none of these rights can be taken as a given, a guarantee, or something that is cemented forever and incapable of being eroded without constant vigilance and advocacy. Again, not everyone will be in a position to be arrested, just as when we took down the flag, we had to assess who could play what roles. And I think that, direct action and civil disobedience will always be a very important part of it, but it's not the only role to play. And everyone must be prepared to resist the current affront to human rights and democracy in this moment in whatever ways they can. Oppression is the result of organized systems of discrimination. And organized systems of discrimination are comprised of individuals making a series of decisions on a daily basis. Likewise, a successfully organized social justice movement is made up of many people doing many different things in many different places, all toward the same end goal of achieving justice for all. It's about examining where you are in time and place and what actions you can personally take to contribute to a collective effort. It's also very important that we not allow purpose to get lost in process. And what I mean by that is that sometimes we can get so caught in the back and forth of how that we forget the why. We can get so caught up on models and statistics and methods and theories that we lose sight of a basic humanity. Ultimately, the root of our social issues is a question of what does it mean to be human? How does our understanding of what it means to be human inform the way in which we organize our society? How does our understanding of what it means to be human inform the way in which we interact with one another? I think that for all the awful that's happening right now, it is forcing us in many ways to re-examine what matters most in life. We live in a society that's often very preoccupied with productivity and measuring our self-worth based on how much we can produce in a given hour or day. One of the impacts of living through a period of high stress such as this is it's reminding us all of the importance of rest, of allowing ourselves to be human with human limitations, and that relying on each other is what makes it all possible, not just the efforts of a single individual. Lastly, I'll say this. I've been praised a lot for my courage. But I want to point out that courage is not about the absence of fear, but rather the belief in something greater than that fear and the determination to fight for it. Now, I'm hardly the first person to say that or express that sentiment, right? I'm just simply testifying to it firsthand. Courage is really rooted in a kind of faith. You have to believe that things can get better and that there's value in taking the necessary risk to make that possible. I faced tremendous fear when I volunteered to climb the flagpole in South Carolina. I returned to my house after that first meeting where we were, deciding whether or not we wanted to do it and who would play what roles. And I, kind of stepped forward and agreed to play that role of scaling the pole. I got back home and I prayed probably more deeply and fervently than I ever have in my life. And I still continue to pray and I still continue to summon courage by thinking of those who came before me and thinking of the courage that they had to exercise in the times through which they lived. Because even though, I came through one circumstance, courage is a daily thing that we have to exercise in these times as we continue to organize. Currently, I am involved in organizing for housing justice and housing rights. We are facing a major eviction crisis in this country right now, on top of the pandemic and the economic crisis and the crisis of racism. And all of those things are completely intertwined. The people who are most at risk of eviction are oftentimes Black women, right? People who are dealing with disabilities, people who are already dealing with illness, the people who are most marginalized in our society. And for people to stand up and fight for themselves against a system that is so designed to keep them down requires a daily kind of courage. And I know that for me, you can ask anyone kind of where they summon their courage from, but for me, it continues to be again the recognition that I would not be where I am at were it not for the courage of people in prior times. And so then as I look around myself and I see what we are facing now, I have to ask myself, what duty, what responsibility do I have to summon that same kind of courage? The fact that we are here, the fact that we are standing on the legacy of those who came before us is proof that it is possible, right? So again, when I go back to talking about courage being rooted in a kind of faith, I have that kind of faith because I know that it's possible, or we wouldn't be here. I understood the risk involved in what I was doing that day in 2015 when I scaled the pole. And I understood, quite logically that there was reason to be afraid of what might happen. But I also understand that as a human being, the measure of my humanity is linked to my ability to recognize the humanity of others. And so, in that, in agreeing to join in this collective ongoing effort of striving toward a society that has yet to be fully realized, we become part of something that is so much greater than ourselves. And that is this ongoing universal struggle of humanity toward a society that is truly free, right? That is not simply a democracy on paper or in name or as a dream, but as an actual living reality. That is the cause that I consider to be greater than myself, that I risk my life for, that I continue to fight for. And that gives me the courage and the strength to continue showing up in this battle. So as we fight to preserve freedoms that are under relentless attack, as we fight to expand those freedoms, we should keep constant remembrance of those who paved the way for us to be in this position today. They have provided for us a blueprint and an example of how it's done. They've established a precedent that we should always remember, that how it is not how it must always be, that we can dream a new world and then work to make it so, that the mighty and the powerful can be toppled by the disenfranchised and the dispossessed, that oppressive powers cannot and do not remain in place forever, especially when confronted by a determined collective of people working together in the interest of justice. Thank you so much for the pleasure and the honor of addressing you. I hope that you all will take something from what I've had to share with you today, that you will summon the courage, that you will look around you and about you, not just to see what you can do as an individual, but what you can do together, because that is how we get where we are trying to go. God bless.